So I wanted to go to an old school video spot. I haven't been in this spot for a little bit here, but I decided today would be a good day for this. Welcome to Radical Self-Respect with Jared Mello. I'd like to help people, of course, with radical self-respect, and specifically people that have come from relationships with a cluster B person, specifically men that have dealt with a cluster B woman. This is the place for you, because that's how I discovered radical self-respect, among other things, was my experience with a narcissistic woman. So to piggyback on that part though, this video is going to be about what if the mother or the father of your child is a cluster B person? What if they're a narcissist? What if they have borderline personality disorder? How do you handle that? Now, full disclosure, I do not have a child with a cluster B woman, so I don't have personal experience with this. Full disclosure. I want to make sure that people know that. But what I'm going to talk about in this video is what my suggestions would be to someone in that scenario. Now, the best case scenario, of course, is the relationship between the kid and the cluster B person, the parent. There is no issues with it, right? And they don't cause any mischief, they don't cause any trouble, and they're a good parent. That's the ideal. Now, that's not always, certainly not the norm, I would say, from what I hear. But that's the best case scenario, in which case you really don't have to do much other than just practice radical self-respect anyway. Have solid boundaries, be assertive, etc. Go gray rock, and always be on the lookout for hoovering of some sorts. The love bomb hoovers in particular. And that's another part of the story too, though. And I'm going to assume that the romantic connection part is gone. And it's more of a co-parenting situation now. So say another scenario. Maybe the mother or father that has cluster B disorder or has a cluster B issue, narcissistic or borderline personality disorder, maybe they try to use the kids against you. Maybe they even try to talk bad stuff about you to the children, kind of as a smear campaign. Now, this is a little more tricky thing to deal with, but I've seen this happen a lot. So boundaries would be number one, as always. And going gray rock / yellow rock. Gray rock is very little emotion, just flat responses. Yellow rock is a little bit more emotional, but not much. The only reason to bring that into the equation is because sometimes a cluster B person will be very upset if they get too much gray rock. So you give them a very little bit just to keep the peace. But say this is what they're doing. They're trying to turn the kids against you. In this case, it would be best if you don't get too emotional about it in front of the children, I would say. What you have to do is you have to have them prepared. And you have to have a full, honest discourse with your children and have them be able to be open and honest with you. And say like, hey, if your mom or dad is saying anything about me, then let me know what it is. Right? And maybe, because you don't know if this is happening right away, right? Maybe they'll say something and maybe they won't. But if they do, I wouldn't recommend giving a reaction to your child. Just listen, hear it out, what the other parents said, and then take it, put it on your bank there, and put it into the back of your head and remember it. And then I would say you can confront, in a very gray rock type way, the other parent, hey, I don't really appreciate when you say these kinds of things to our children. Because oftentimes you're not going to want to have to cut them off from their child's life, but it does get to that point in some cases when they're going to be very toxic. Now, depending on the gender, that can make a difference here too, but often they do want to keep contact. The courts want the parents to have contact, especially if it's a woman, right? More so than it's a man. But I think this Amber Heard situation has also brought to light cluster B women and how they can be an issue. Although lucky for them, I don't think there was any kids in that scenario at all. But I would say you got to have lines in the sand. boundaries where if that cluster B parent crosses them, there has to be consequences, right? And there's a difference between controlling behavior and healthy boundaries. The controlling behavior is when we allow ourselves to be emotionally taken away and swept away by someone else's actions, right? When we have wisdom, we understand the only person we can control is ourselves. And so we will have our boundaries and we will clearly lay out what will happen if someone does not respect our boundaries, and we keep it emotionally under control, right? We do not lose our gourds, because we all know what happens when you lose your gourds with a cluster B person, especially if they're narcissistic. They will absolutely use those emotions against you. They will spin it around, make you feel like you're the bad guy, gaslight you, flip the script, anything to get their hooks into you. And the more emotion you give them, the more likely that could possibly be. That's why the gray rock, and at the most, yellow rock, that's why they are so important. So I talked about the scenario where they're trying to use the kids against you. That's something where, like I said, you got to have a good discourse with your children so that they're able to be honest with you about what's really going on. Because that is messed up. That is certainly messed up. And say if the parent, when you confront them, they deny it, or they gaslight, in which case you would say, you have to have a talk with the kids and say, listen, sometimes what your mother or father says about me isn't always true. Do me a favor. If he says anything, or she says anything that I've done, come and talk to me about it, no matter what it is. And it'll be a judgment-free zone. And as long as the children feel comfortable enough in that scenario, I think that's a great way to play it. Now, other kinds of things that might happen, maybe they're always trying to hoover you back in every time you see them. And every time you drop the kids off, they're trying to hoover you in. Again, clear boundaries, solid boundaries will be your friend in that scenario. Now, I don't know what other kinds of scenarios could even happen. I hear mothers talk about how the fathers, they don't always take care of the children in the best way when they have cluster B issues, like they're narcissistic. Maybe they don't do the things like tell them to brush their teeth or take baths or showers or whatever. This is another thing that's going to require a stern conversation where you would say, hey, when our kids are with you, make sure they bathe, make sure they brush their teeth, make sure they do those essential activities, right? Because sometimes that can happen too, right? Where the kids just aren't being taken care of to the same level than when they're with you. And again, depending on how old the kids are, you can have that conversation with them too. Like, hey, I know your mother or father doesn't make you brush your teeth, but brush your teeth. Or I know you don't have to bathe with them, but make sure you take care of yourself and you wash yourself. Honesty and open communication in all of these areas are going to be humongous, right? And it's not always going to be possible with the cluster B person. Sometimes they're going to make that as difficult as possible very purposefully, especially when we have strong boundaries in an area where they're trying to love bomb Hoover, they're trying to sleep with us again. Yes, if we have our strong boundaries, they might throw a hissy fit. They might get annoyed and try to gaslight. But in my experience also, they eventually give up. They can eventually give up. Now, some are more tenacious than others. And again, when you have children, you have that tie with them. There's always going to be that tie, unless there's a reason for it to be severed via the courts or something. But they also know that. They know they have that tie to you, that you probably want them to be able to see the mother or father of your children, right? And they're going to try to use that to their advantage to get away with more. So again, boundaries will be key. Get boundaries with clear consequences, and then ignore whatever chatter occurs. Now, if you're very lucky though, maybe you'll be able to be cordial and they won't be displaying too many toxic behaviors about it. Maybe. Now that's probably pretty rare, but it's possible, I would say. It's possible maybe if they had BPD and went to a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy and did a lot of work on themselves, maybe you can be cordial about it. But again, as always, trust but verify. I wouldn't believe anything until I saw it with my own two eyes consistently for a longer period of time. So again, to reiterate the video here, gray rock, yellow rock, strong boundaries, emotional self-control, clear consequences for behaviors, and making sure you have honest communication with the kids and a judgment-free zone so that they are able to talk to you about anything the other parent has said about you, right? You tell them, hey, anything they say about me, I'd like to know about it. You're not going to be in trouble or anything. I'm not going to be mad at you. I'm just curious what the other parent is saying, if they ever do, right? And then also tell them about the things about brushing their teeth, bathing, self-care. Make sure they do that. And some of this will also depend on the age of the child, of course. This might be a little easier when they're over 10, into their teenage years. They have a little more understanding of what's going on. A little harder when they're younger than that. It's going to be a little more difficult because it's going to be more difficult in those scenarios. But those are the things that kind of came to my head as good suggestions. And sometimes, if you haven't even left the partner yet, I know when I used to volunteer for the SUI hotline, I guess we'll call it, for YouTube purposes here, they would never tell us to tell someone in an abusive situation to just leave. They would always say, you need to tell them to have a plan. You have a plan because depending on the person, they might get pretty volatile or they could even get violent if you just try to go up and leave. So it's important to have plans in some of these situations too, if you're actually still with that cluster B person. But most of this video is for when you've broken free and you're co-parenting now at this point, and you're no longer romantically involved with them or sexually involved with them. These are the ways to play it. These are the guidelines. If I missed anything, if I didn't talk about a scenario that's affecting you out there, gentlemen, or you out there, women either, if you have a scenario I didn't mention it in the comments below. I think it'd be great, and I'll try to address it because I fully admit this isn't a scenario I have dealt with. Right? I've dated narcissistic women, borderline women, comorbid versions of both, but I've never had a child with one. So I'm only speaking from what I think my suggestions would be. So if there's any other circumstances out there that I didn't cover that you would like clarity on, I would love to help you out with that, and I would give you my suggestions from the radical self-respect lens. So comment below what you think about this video. Do you agree with my suggestions? Again, are there any other circumstances that you would like to see me cover? Or is there anything you disagreed with? I'd love to hear it. So with that, thank you very much for watching and have a good one.